So, but just to give you an idea, okay, so this guy was a Confederate officer. This is Moody Building, and he was a Confederate officer. You have right over here was a Confederate officer, Henry Martin Trueheart, with the Trueheart Adriance Building. You have right down on the other side of the street was the largest slave market west of the Mississippi, the Sydnor Auction House. And it was, again, the largest slave market west of the Mississippi. Right here on this street corner was where the Osterman Building was, and this was where the Juneteenth order was issued on June 19th of 1865. So having the slave market across the street from the Juneteenth location is very interesting. And then we have all these connections with the Civil War here. That's one of the reasons I call this the Civil War corner of Galveston. The location here between Galveston and Houston was by far and away the most important part of Texas. And so both sides during the Civil War viewed this Galveston area as the key to Texas.
Ed Cotham is an award-winning author with many books about the Civil War in Texas, including Juneteenth and the Battle of Galveston. Be sure to check out Ed's new book, Decisions of the Galveston Campaigns, the 21 critical decisions that define the operations.
Yeah, that was the first Confederate headquarters in Texas, really, was in that building, and the Lone Star Rifles, which was Company L of Hood's Texas Brigade, ultimately drilled on the third floor there. Ebenezer B. Nichols was basically the finance arm of the Galveston Confederate effort. And so very early on, he was sent over to New Orleans to try to get some money to finance the Confederate war effort. But, you know, there weren't a lot of people willing to loan an outfit in the process of rebellion money. So Nichols actually put his own credit on the line to do that. His house was over on Broadway, right next to Ashton Villa. It's where the Seatley Mansion is today. And it was a very impressive house at the time. He actually had a bowling alley in the backyard, which was kind of unusual for the time.
That is very unusual.
But when U.S. Grant comes here in 1880, he's a big deal, huge deal when U.S. Grant shows up. They've never had anybody, a president like that, general of the army, huge celebrity. And when he's coming into town, everybody hears that he's coming and rushes out to get a view of him because he's a celebrity, big thing in those days. And there was a young boy who went up on the top of this building and got so excited when General Grant came, they started jumping up and down, yelling, "He's here, he's here, he's here." And he fell off the building and dislocated both of his arms and broke one of his legs. And General Grant, President Grant, of course, former President Grant, the next morning goes to the newspaper office and hears that this little boy named Sweeney has fallen off of this building and hurt himself. And they're going for a stroll, and they decide that they'll drop by Sweeney's house and commiserate with the young man and ask him how he's doing and hope he's getting along well. And they do that. And so General Grant called on the house of this poor boy just to make sure he was doing okay. Grant made only 2 personal house visits while he was in town. One was for this boy Sweeney, and the other one was at Ashton Villa. So that just tells you the importance that Grant associated with dealing with somebody that was in need. So in early 1861, an organization was started here in Galveston by a group of men that were unofficial representatives of the Committee on Public Safety, and they were directed to try and keep a watch on the ship traffic that was coming off the entrance to Galveston Bay. And they didn't really have any kind of formal organization, but they referred to themselves as the Jolos, J-O-L-O-S. And we never really knew what those initials stood for, but the men kept a detailed logbook on their activities here and all the ship traffic that they saw, anything that might potentially be a military action that they saw. All of that's detailed in an incredibly detailed logbook that's in the collection of the Rosenberg Library. And the men kept their office, and where they had their main part of activity was right there on top of the Henley building, which had been built 4 or 5 years before the advent of the Civil War. And there was a white cupola, which is kind of a little storehouse building on the top of this building where they kept their log, kept their telescopes and all the things they needed to record their activities and to signal to other places around about what the ship traffic was like. We always called them the lookouts, and people at the time called them the lookouts, so we assumed that the J-O-L-O, that the L-O stood for lookout. But we never really knew how that originated. And a few weeks ago, I happened upon a letter in the Houston Post in 1900 that actually kind of defines what those activities were. And it turns out that a man named Gearing actually wrote a letter to the Veterans Column and said that he was here when all these activities were going on. And he says the Jolos were a bunch of steamboat men like himself, because he was a steamer captain and actually owned parts of 2 different vessels. And that these men started this organization informally. The initials J-O-L-O stood for Jolly Old Loafers Office. Loafer with an apostrophe, because they considered themselves loafers. Now you might say that's a weird name for a military organization, but again, this is not an official military organization. And these guys treated this activity as anything but a military organization. The logbook records, the weather of the day, the ship traffic, everything they were supposed to record, but it also recorded that they had a lot of fun in this particular activity. One night, they came out of the office there and came down the stairs and went up and down the Strand until they could beg enough money to buy them something to eat. They even found a water cooler they brought back on one occasion. One night they came out and went up and down the Strand, and they found somebody with a pie, and they seized that pie to use it for military purposes. Another night they came out and just were randomly going up and down the Strand looking for something to do, and they recorded in the notebook a bloody battle going on with mosquitoes, and that the results were entirely doubtful. So this was not the conventional military organization. But the office started right here in the cupola on the Henley building right behind us.
And do you know if there's any damage back here?
I'm 100% certain there was damage back here. The problem is that you just don't know what it's from, because this thing went through the 1900 storm. It had an incredible amount of damage done to it then. It's gone through, probably a lot of damage was done during Mardi Gras, I'm thinking too, I don't know. But and we have that picture that's in the Rosenberg Library it's an eyewitness drawing taken from somewhere out there, probably from Pelican Spit, of this battlefield. And it shows this building with cannons pointing out of basically every other window here. And you can actually see the cannons poking out of this building from the 2nd floor. And the thing that's always puzzled people is, how in the world, in the middle of the night, would you be able to get cannons up to the 2nd floor of a building like that and point them out? And then the other thing is, I take groups up there, tour groups up there occasionally, and we sit there in that building, and you say, okay, imagine you're in here and a cannon is being fired out of that window. What would the sound be like in this room? It would have been crazy. And you have cannon firing from there. You've got men on the roof firing from prepared positions up there on top, sharpshooters, because the only Union land troops that are in the battle are over in that direction, over at Coons Wharf, which is at 18th Street. We're at 20th Street here, but the Coons Wharf was over there on 18th Street, and that's where the Union land troops were. So that column there is definitely damaged from the Battle of Galveston, and you can tell, nothing minor happened there. That is a serious piece of architecture that's been damaged. And one thing I like to do sometimes is I'll take kids on battlefield tours here in Galveston. And when we get to this position, we do a science experiment, and I'll have a tape measurer, and we'll actually kind of measure off, all right, if to hit that thing and knock that piece off there, where would something have to come from that did that? And we take our tape measure and we move it out in this direction and figure the angle. And then we have some pretty good maps of where all the Union ships were during the battle. And so the kids and I get out the maps and we look at our angles and we look at where this ship would have had to have been to fire the shot, or the piece of shell actually, that knocked that off the building. And when you measure all that out and figure it out, it turns out it was probably the USS Owasco, which was one of the ships that the Union had during the Battle of Galveston. This is the one from the front. Now, this is probably 18 70s or 80s, but you can see the front part of our little white cupola here where the Jolos had their headquarters. And so JR and I are now on our own kind of letters of marque piracy activity along the Strand, trying to find things to support the effort here, but this is where the action was in 1861.